I've worked with a lot of bad orchestras over the years. Also good ones, but a lot of bad ones too. Let's be honest, beggars can't be choosers. Ensembles, bands, orchestras, they cost a lot of money to run. And so as a composer, even if you get to work with a bad one, it's better than nothing, right? But there are a couple of hacks that you can use when working with a terrible ensemble that will help you to get the most out of them. Bear in mind, these are just some things that have worked for me and for some of my colleagues over the years. You can take them or leave them, and if you've had a different experience, leave them in the comments. Tip number 1, try to find out how many rehearsals you'll get. Most professional orchestras and ensembles only have 2 or 3 rehearsals before a concert, and from my experience, most musicians don't really look at the music before the first rehearsal. Assume that they're only going to play through the piece a handful of times before the premiere, and this will deter you from writing really complicated music. If the music is too hard, it can only go bad. Tip number 2, try to get an idea beforehand of where the ensemble's strengths and weaknesses lie. Maybe go to some concerts, or if you have any contacts within the ensemble, ask if they can tell you what players are good and which ones aren't. That way you can customize your score a bit around the performers. Tip number 3, try to avoid thin, clean chords and instrumentation. I've often heard violinists say that some of the hardest violin concertos for them to play are those by Mozart, which seems a little bit counterintuitive because there are many more violin concertos that are significantly more virtuosic than Mozart. But what makes these concerti difficult is the amount of precision required in regards to things like intonation. Have a listen to this. This is extraordinarily fragile music. The harmonic voicings, the instrumentation, it's all very clean and it's very thin. So the performers are completely exposed. You will hear every single slightly wrong note. In contrast, late romantic music or impressionism, for example, often uses more complex harmonies as well as instrumental techniques that are slightly blurry. Things like trills, bisbigliando, tremolo, rapid arpeggio. In other words, an orchestration that's very full with lots of ornamentation that uses more complex chords is going to mask many more imperfections when it comes to things like tuning. Tip number 4, consider using aleatoric elements. So aleatoric elements are aspects to the composition that are left to chance, and this here would be an example. The performer has to repeat these notes as fast as possible for the duration of the line. It could also be notated like this, for example, or perhaps like this. There's an aspect of randomness to this because everyone's going to play it at different speeds. As fast as possible is going to be different for every single performer. Now, on its own, something like this might not be that useful, but in a group, it can be used to create some very organic sounding textures. And building this sort of flexibility into your material can be very beneficial if your musicians aren't very good. Practically anyone can play this. Here's another example. This is also something that anyone can play. It creates a soft background atmosphere that could be used behind something else, such as a melody. And yet the musicians, well, they don't have to count, they don't have to play anything precisely, they can just improvise on these notes. The musicians can then just wait for the conductor to give them the cue to stop or the cue to go on to the next moment in the score. And although it might seem lazy to write something like this, it's a fantastic effect that can be played by practically anyone. Tip number 5, atmospheric music in general will always work better with bad orchestras. Music that creates a sort of sound cloud, or music that uses clusters, or music that uses lots of resonant instruments is much more forgiving. Because this sort of music is more about the sound experience, you don't have to worry too much about your performers playing out of tune or playing the wrong rhythm, because what comes across to the public is that macro sound environment. Tip number 6, don't write anything that depends too much on rhythmic precision. Sometimes you're going to want to write something like this. Here we have some rhythmic orchestral hits. Now, this example is a bad idea for 2 reasons. First of all, these rhythms are just a little bit too awkward. There's no way that they're going to be able to play these rhythms tight and together. So obviously, you're going to want to simplify these rhythms. But what makes things even worse is that if someone makes a mistake, they're going to play in the gap in between the hits. You're going to hear that mistake. And this is also going to make the musicians nervous. If they make a mistake, everyone's going to hear it. And so you'll find that half of the orchestra, they're not even going to play the hits. Tip number 7, don't make a musical moment depend on one fragile thing. Look at this example. So in this passage, we have a lot of 16th notes that are there to drive the tempo. If these notes aren't played clearly and in tempo, it ruins the whole passage. The whole passage depends on those 16th notes being played well. You can hear from this example that the musicians are really struggling to keep in time. They can't play the 16ths consistently. It's just too fast for them. But if the tempo were slower, you would lose that drive, that feeling of suspense. The only way that this passage is going to work properly is with musicians that can play that fast. If everything hangs on just this one fragile thing, you're setting yourself up for failure. Tip number 8, notate the score and parts as clearly as possible. Now, you would think that this would be a no-brainer, but you would be surprised how many composers make this mistake and just don't notate things properly or clearly. In fact, this is a tip that really applies to any orchestra you ever work with. In a rehearsal, every single minute counts, and you don't want to be wasting your time clarifying any questions regarding the notation. Tip number 9, don't lose your cool. When you see that they're not doing what you want them to, don't get angry. As frustrating as it might be, you kind of need them to play your music. Be as friendly as possible, try to get to know the musicians, talk about their parts with them, discuss potential compromises, and the exact same goes for your relationship with the conductor. Getting angry, well, it usually doesn't help, and don't forget, the musical community is quite small and a bad reputation will spread like wildfire. Tip number 10. Please make a recording. I can't stress this enough. Even if the ensemble doesn't play very well, and even if the recording isn't very good, having a bad recording is better than having nothing. There are really powerful audio editing tools out there these days, and who knows, you might be able to salvage more of the recording than you think. You might be able to clean up the quality or digitally remove many of the mistakes. In fact, if possible, I also try to record the last 2 rehearsals before the performance as well. The more material you record, the more you have to work with later on when you're editing. And I mean, even if you have to throw out like half of the recording, who cares? You know, it's something concrete that you can then play for other people and maybe even put online. And my final tip would be this. Try to treat the opportunity as a stepping stone to something better. It's a chance for you to learn. I mean, forget Juilliard. One of the world's greatest places for music education is the School of Hard Knocks. And let's be real, people who've had a music career undeservedly explode out of nothing are often insufferably arrogant individuals. Sometimes one of the best lessons to be learned from these sorts of experiences is just one of humility. Now, as I said, these are just a couple of tips that I've found to work for me in the past, but if you have any more, well, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm interested what everyone else's take is on this. Bye. Goodbye. Goodbye.